Diese Bildnis ist bezaubernd schön. Wie
Michelangelo, I hate to interrupt your little tune there.
yeah.
Who composed that again?
That was the second most popular composer of the last 1,000 years, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart.
Oh, really? Who was the first?
Oh, Paul McCartney. You didn't know that?
I was wondering if you were going to say Bach or Beethoven, but you surprised me.
No.
Yes, that
Paul
can
McCartney.
happen. Yes,
yeah, it was a survey conducted by the BBC or something, and Mozart came in second, which I think is pretty good considering he's not been around for a long time.
Paul McCartney was the first?
Yeah.
The last 1,000. Well, that's totally ridiculous.
Yeah, I know.
Since for almost all of that time, nobody knew he wasn't even born yet. It's just these things are so subjective. It's kind of it's like really, but most popular. I don't. And what about some Chinese or Indian composer?
Oh no, they didn't.
That we've never heard of. But they might have been popular for 800 years of that, and we would have no idea. But anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, kind of.
I think there was probably a certain Anglo-American bias, probably.
It kind of sounds like it.
Yeah.
Nothing against Paul McCartney, but
no.
Don't want to trash the guy in any way, shape, or form. And he made a lot more money that Mozart could have learned something from him, how to make money, for example. But then there were people behind the Beatles, how that went. That was
oh, yeah, no question.
Yeah. But now our subject is Mozart.
Yes.
So here we have a famous musician, classical musician, if there ever was one. What's your stance on Mozart in general? Before we get into his chart, just where do you stand on Mozart, Michelangelo?
Well, of course, as a professional opera singer, I did do a few performances of Die Zauberflöte, and I always enjoyed singing it.
Flute, yes.
Yeah, and some songs, and I've certainly listened to my share of Mozart down through the years. My own personal taste is somewhat less for the Apollonian splendors of Mozart and the other classicists, but you got to give the man his due. I mean, the enduring quality of what he composed is truly exceptional, and he's very interesting, very interesting personality as well, I think.
Yeah. Well, many of them were, of course.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just about to record a composer now for my music channel. His name was Georg Simon Lörlein. I bet you haven't heard of him, have you?
No. I think he came in number 3 on that poll, didn't he?
No, not quite. Maybe 3 million. Maybe 3 million. I don't know. No, interesting. It's just interesting little tidbits. This guy, at the age of 17, he was already 1.90 meters, which is kind of strange back in the 18th century, right? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, then some of these guys, I forget what they called them, they used to go around forcing you into the military. They would kidnap you and force you into like Frederick the Great's military. They saw this young lad of only 17, 190, thought he has to be a soldier. So they kidnapped him, and he was in the Prussian army. I think it was Prussian army for 16 years. And then he became a pretty well-known composer of his time. These little biographical things. It's more interesting than Mozart in a way, a line like that. But anyway, I'm going to record some of his music for the first time. Nobody's recorded it for this harpsichord.
Wow, good for you. Wow.
Now, Mozart's been recorded, thousands and thousands of times because he's Mozart, of course. And we want to look into his chart and see, a little note here, people. You cannot tell genius in a chart just by looking at the chart. Just as you cannot tell insanity, you cannot tell stupidity or intelligence even. You can tell certain signs. You can say, if this person's a genius, then what might his genius look like? But just by looking at the chart, we won't be able to see, oh, look, there's proof there's a genius. I know astrologers do that a lot. Look, he has this, so it's obviously a genius. It's hogwash. That really does not work. I learned that at a very young age. Thomas Ring, the great German astrologer, pointed out these things in his books that have never been translated because his style was extremely complicated, and it'd be a task to translate them. But anyway, so we won't try to say because he has this, he was a genius. What we will be saying is, well, he had this, so what kind of a genius was he? When you look at his chart now, Michelangelo, what strikes you?
Well, I'll just say right at the top that the decan that he's born in, the first decan of Aquarius, apparently more
Can you
creative
define
artists.
decant for the listeners, some of whom might be?
Well, it's basically division of the 30 degrees of the sign into three 10-degree segments.
Yes, right.
Yeah. It goes all the way back to the Egyptians and who knows, maybe even back to Atlantis. We don't know.
Yes, you never know.
But according to surveys that I came across and an interesting book that I had for many years called Tarot and Astrology, more creative persons have been born during the first decade of Aquarius, many of whom became famous than almost any other.
I didn't know that. That's very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, I got here just a little laundry list. In addition to Mozart, we have Robert Burns, Lord Byron, Arthur Rubinstein, Lewis Carroll, Edouard Manet, Virginia Woolf, Emanuel Swedenborg, and I just finished an essay on Django Reinhardt, the famous gypsy jazz guitarist. And, there's surely many others. So there's something about
is this really statistically done? Did they really take like 10,000 people and...
that I don't know. I don't
because
know.
Otherwise, there are thousands of famous people, and maybe it was done like Michel Gauquelin did his studies, with like 5,000, 10,000 people, because then it's solid. Otherwise, it's,
Well, that's a pretty impressive list of creative types. But yeah, I don't know. I have come across
it could well be because
one place.
Hey, Muzio Clementi, just to mention another famous composer, 4 years older than Mozart, he knew Mozart, and I was looking at his chart as well, and he was born. Let's see, he had the sun like I think 8 or 9 degrees Aquarius.
Yep.
So he would fit into that pattern as well. Yes, I have it here. Oh no, excuse me, 2 degrees Aquarius.
Oh, that's where Django Reinhardt is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why, looky there.
Yep.
Yeah. So there could be something to that.
Yeah, but it's interesting anyway to contemplate this idea. Why necessarily? I mean, that's the decade of Aquarius that's associated with Venus. So maybe that's got something to do with it.
Well, Aquarius has to do with the greater world as well, more so than the opposite Leo. Where Cancer signs are more concentrated on family a lot of time. But Aquarius is going out there and, well, maybe brotherhood on one level, or interacting with the entire world. So that would be conducive more to becoming famous, I would think. Although that would mean that a lot of Capricorn, maybe more Capricorns and Cancer people that are famous, might also be.
Possibly. Right? Don't know. It's just one of those little tidbits we like to throw in. One
of those promising statistical studies that I'll never do because you need years to do it, and I don't want to spend years doing that particular study. But any people out there might want to do it. It wouldn't be that hard to do, really. Yeah. Well, it would take a few years because you have to collect maybe 10,000 pieces of data, famous people, define what famous means, etc., etc. You want to do it truly scientifically. But interesting. Yeah. Well, what else do you see in his chart here that just strikes you?
Well, where are we on the same page time-wise? I've got, of course, January 27th, 1756 at 8 p.m.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I remember when I first started astrology way back in 1977, I had some old German books there, and Mozart was one of the charts there, and it was 8 p.m. In other words, that was really written down by the family.
Yeah,
and that's not speculation. It's not some kind of shady rectification, not knowing what time he was born. No, that it's 8. Now, it could have been 8:05 or 7:52, whatever. You could use rectification to specify taking a lot of events from his life. And that would probably work, I would think, if the time isn't off by too much, which it probably isn't. I don't think it's off by an hour or anything, probably maybe 15 minutes at most. And maybe it was exactly 8, who knows. But yes, the Virgo ascendant there, which you would have in any case, because it's 12 degrees Virgo, not like 1 or whatever.
Yeah.
In case he was born before 8.
Yep.
So
I had a thought and then it just went away. A lot of air in the chart. That's the first thing that strikes me. And
okay, take the air in the chart.
Yeah.
Now let's think of his music. How would you connect that?
Well, air is very fluent. I mean, in my experience, and admittedly, I haven't done analyses of thousands of horoscopes, but I've been fairly active in the last.
Don't get sarcastic here, Michelangelo.
Well, some people have. Some of our peers.
I know some have. Paul Westran, people look up Paul Westran.
Yeah,
he did a monumental study on secondary progressions. And even more data than Gauquelin used for his monumental study. So that's a modern day proponent of statistics. But he worked on that for 20 years, his study. So that's what I mean.
Yeah. But to my way of thinking, based on, first of all, my experience as a classical musician and a composer myself, and my knowledge of the lives of any number of composers, I think you have to have a great deal of air in the chart to be able to produce large scale works. They lend themselves to this tremendous, what's the word I would use? Volubility, so there's just a plethora of ideas. And so when we look, we see that what do we have? We have Venus at 29 Aquarius, we have Mercury at 8, the Sun at 7, Saturn at 1, and then we have Jupiter at 18 Libra. So that's what, five planets in air. That's quite a lot.
Yeah, that is one thing that strikes you. And with the air element, I'm looking at Beethoven's chart here as you speak, because as I recalled, Beethoven has practically nothing in air except fixed for Mars in Gemini. I don't know if that's enough. With the large scale works, I would try to, not that you're wrong in what you say, but you said then that because of the many ideas, a large scale work doesn't have to have that many ideas necessarily.
No, and that's the thing. Beethoven worked out his themes, as you know, David, I'm sure, laboriously, and he would work on a single theme for months,
and Mozart was the opposite. He'd be playing billiards and say, and then jot down, this or that. He was one of those people. Like Telemann was like that too. They could just.
Oh, was he? Oh, yeah.
Well, there was a story that Handel meets Telemann. Wouldn't you like to have been there?
Sure.
Handel meets Telemann. I was having a conversation, but Handel said later that Handel couldn't believe it, because while they're having a conversation, Telemann was writing down the voices to an 11-part motet. Just, in the middle of a conversation, He was working out 11 voices simultaneously. And apparently even Handel couldn't do that. Just as like Mozart composed. He was playing billiards and then, let me jot down some things from this next symphony or whatever. And Beethoven, he really labored over this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So Mozart and Telemann are examples of these supreme geniuses for whom it was so easy. Now, in the case of Mozart, we have works of supreme genius that are just evergreens and just the pinnacle of music. With Telemann, all of his works are good, but a single work of Telemann that is so monumental, like Bach's B minor Mass or...
No, not really.
No, that's the thing. Excuse me.
A bit more like Hindemith in that way, I think. Sort of Gebrauchsmusik, and very good, very serviceable, obviously,
Well, some of it, I know he wrote more harpsichord music than I knew about up to just a few years ago, and some is really, really good. His violin solo works are fantastic. My wife said, is that Bach or what? But the thing is, a lot of his music hasn't ever been published, let alone recorded, so we don't know. Maybe those big things will come out then. He wrote 3 times as much as Bach did. And Mozart in his, 36 years, not quite, right?
Wow.
He was still 35 when he died. And the quantity of music that he wrote, just incredible.
Yeah.
And that connects to the air, the ideas, right? Also, I thought the air signs, it's breath, it's related to singing for that reason.
Sure. Yeah.
And think of the melodist that Mozart was. Beethoven wasn't really a really, truly great melodist as was Mozart or Bach. Some of the things were kind of clumsy that he wrote for voice.
Yeah.
But Mozart, my God, it's divine. It's divine.
Yeah. If you do Andi Ferner Geliebte or, some of his songs there.
Yeah.
Or even Fidelio. I've worked a little bit on Fidelio, and it's not the most gracious music. Or even the choral parts in the Ninth Symphony. They're really kind of they're monumental, but not really human. There's something about that.
Yeah, not tailored to the human voice as. If he just was writing absolute music, and he didn't care whether singers or the violinist could play the parts. He said that the violinist said, I write music the way it should be written and deal with it. Basically, that's what he said.
Yeah. I got an interesting quote here from Mozart on melody. He wrote, "Melody is the essence of music. I compare a good melodist to a fine racer and counterpointists to hack post horses." Therefore, be advised, let well alone, and remember the old Italian proverb, "Chi sa più meno sa," who knows most knows least. So that's interesting because we.
So it's Bach versus Mozart now. Is that what?
Yeah. He sort of. Did he know about it? Would he have known about Bach? I don't know
Well,
if he would have
yeah,
been.
there's a story. I don't know how old he was, maybe 20, I
Yeah,
don't know. He goes to a
yeah,
church someplace where they had manuscripts of Bach. So he said, let me
yeah.
show you this. Mozart took them and he was so fascinated. He put them all out on the floor. He was studying them, he just couldn't believe what he was seeing.
Wow.
But in that sense, you have to say about Bach, he wasn't just a counterpointist. His gift for melody was also supreme.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
I think
No
that's what
question about
fascinated
that.
Mozart. Oh my God, look, here's counterpoint, but look how beautiful the
Yeah,
melodies are and
yeah,
the voices are. And
yeah.
look what he does with this. Because there is such a thing as dry counterpoint, of course.
Oh yeah, academic, sure.
But yeah, the good melody thing, that's why I always say, look, even if it's rock music, if there's a good melody there, it's worth something.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think, not wanting to get too off our topic here, but I think in many ways classical music has abandoned melody since the First World War, and pop music did it much later. And we're living in an era now where there really is a dearth of melody,
Yeah, we'll
which
talk
is
about that
unfortunate.
someday in a separate
Yeah,
episode.
yeah,
To get back to his chart here, tell
yeah.
me what other things have just pop into
Well,
your
I mean, what we've got the Sun, Mercury, and Saturn in the fifth, if we use Placidus houses.
equal
Looks like
houses as
it's
well. It's the
equal to,
same.
so
Yeah.
that's a fairly intense concentration in the Leo house that is associated with creative self-expression, among other things, of course.
Yes. So we have creative self-expression, but then we have Saturn there too. Wouldn't that block the creative self-expression?
Well, again, I'll speak from my own experience.
Yeah.
As someone with elevated Saturn and in the ninth,
Yeah.
I had a lot of trouble when I was younger with academics.
Yeah.
But latterly, I've become consistent with ninth house symbolism, a teacher, a writer, a world traveler, all of these things. And Saturn definitely caused delays there. But I think a lot of people feel that while Saturn may initially cause delays, eventually it proves through the what's the word I would use? The no, I'm going blank. The postponement of immediate gratification, the immediate success, it produces a much more impressive result in time rather
Well,
than,
yes, but he was famous even as a child.
Well, he was a child prodigy.
And
More, I
traveling
think,
to
more.
Paris and becoming, beloved all over the place, even as a
Yeah,
kid. So it's not
yeah,
delayed. I would see Saturn more as Saturn contraction being its most basic meaning. But
yeah.
here we have Saturn as form. If you think of the form, Mozart was a master of form.
Okay.
So if he had tried to write maybe music that was just freer and, no form, he might have failed miserably. But it
Yeah.
was he was paying Saturn its due, its tribute by the form. Of course, I can say that only because I know Mozart, right?
Sure. Well, we can also look at it. The fact that we do have Sun Saturn conjunction, and
Yeah.
and in that regard, then I'm very tempted to think about the influence of his father, because he had a tremendous influence on his son. I mean, he was largely
Indeed.
responsible, I think, for turning him into an itinerant child prodigy, and obviously reaping a great deal of benefit therefrom.
Right.
I think.
Wait, you don't think
So
the father did it just for the money, do you?
No, not totally, but
Old
I'm sure that had to have
Leopold
been at least
Mozart.
part of the incentive. I mean, you've got a brilliant kid, and you certainly want to take him to the bank if you can. I mean, I don't think fathers have changed all that much in several centuries.
Well, I wasn't that kind of brilliant kid, but my father wouldn't have done that. I'll tell you, he seriously
Yeah.
wouldn't. He wouldn't think, well, let's take this kid there. Let's see if how much money make. No, my father was totally different there. I have to say,
Yeah, but I mean,
he was
but
all
think
what's
about
best
the
for the
life.
kid, not what's best for the purse.
Yeah, but think about the life of an itinerant virtuoso in that era. It must have been grueling at times.
Well, itinerant virtuosi in that sense, in fact, almost didn't exist back then. There were some,
Yeah.
but it was always the composer virtuoso. So it was about the music
Yeah.
and not just the
Yeah.
playing. I wanted to look something up though. You mentioned the Saturn-Sun conjunction,
Yeah.
which here has like an
Yeah.
orb of 5 degrees. I put into a program. I wanted to see if there might be a declination parallel as well
Oh, yeah.
between
let me
those
see.
two planets. Yeah, but it's 2 degrees orb, so it's really not too strong there. So it's just the 5-degree orb conjunction between Sun and Saturn. But then Sun and Saturn, when you see that, you don't necessarily think music, do you? Where do you see the music in his chart?
Oh, the music. Well, I mean, opposing the Sun-Mercury conjunction, of course, we have Neptune.
And that's pretty close, isn't it? That's like within a degree or two or something like that.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, 2
technically,
degrees.
I guess Neptune's at the Sun-Mercury conjunction, Sun-Mercury midpoint. I mean, so that's
yeah, it's close to it. Sun Mercury is 7 degrees. No, Sun's 7, Mercury is 8, and
8. Yeah,
and Neptune is 10 or 9. 9. Yeah, 7, 8, 9.
9:38. Yeah,
That's a pretty close opposition in any case.
Yeah. And,
what effects would you see with this up in Mozart's life and maybe in general as well?
Well, I mean, Neptune brings that connection to the immanent. I mean, I think many commentators associate it with music, because music, in many ways, is even though obviously we imposed form upon it, its essence, its nature is inchoate. It's mysterious. It comes from these deep well springs of inspiration, or I mean, whatever we want to call it, and we sort of grab hold of it and wrestle it into some kind of form, which allows us to bring it into manifestation. But at its core, I think it really does partake of something authentically mysterious, and I mean, and I would argue, I think in many ways that music really represents one of the more profound ways that human beings have tried to express something of the divine, so it has that.
Well, that's a good thought. Yes,
it's spiritual basis true. That informs it, I think. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Of course, it's Neptunian. Of course, Neptune opposition Sun. He could have been an alcoholic or drug addict as well.
Let's see. He didn't really have any vices other than scatological humor and billiards, I guess. Right?
And he was somewhat adulterous. And he did like drink, I believe. I don't think he became an alcoholic. I don't think so. But
no, Handel was definitely an alcoholic, but I don't think that.
Oh, really? I don't know if I remember it reading.
Yeah. He liked his port.
And he couldn't handle it, or what? Because he was a big guy.
No, I think he had a little bit of trouble with it. If I remember.
That's interesting. I kind of missed that. I don't mean I miss it like, just like I miss you, dear, because you're so far away. I don't mean that sense. I mean, I don't remember reading that. That's what I mean. Put it more clearly. The Neptune. To get into that Neptune thing, Neptune with Saturn here to the up, because that's also, not a strong opposition from the orb, but the Saturn conjunction Sun Mercury and then opposition Neptune. What kind of flavor does that give you?
Well, again, the same idea, that here we have the challenge, I think, that face all creative artists of bringing something that is purely of the realm of ideas into a manageable form. And of course, it's a very close opposition between Mercury and Neptune. So again, that's a really, I think, extremely, what's the word I would use? Consistent with the whole idea, of a lot of air, we have this inspirational component of Neptune that informs the intellectual process and keeps it from becoming sterile or too academic.
Yes, that's true. On the one hand, a very strong sense of form and of details, one could say, with Mercury, Saturn. But on the other hand, that intuitional aspect, search for the spiritual, going beyond all the technique and the form.
I mean, I think that. Well, he said it in that little quote. He said, the contrapuntalists, he didn't have any use for them. He felt that melody was really the sine qua non. So even though he had the capacity, and he was working within a recently established tradition, using sonata allegro form and all the other types of fixed forms that they used in the classical period. But within that framework, he was nevertheless able to bring this tremendous level of inspiration.
What would he have thought of 12-tone music?
I think he would have felt it was an abomination, probably.
I think he would have thrown up, personally, because...
I mean, I think some of the greatest masters of 12-tone music were able to accomplish something that would pass muster as expression. But we're hardwired as human beings to recognize and appreciate tonality. We don't mind straying from it, but to abandon it utterly, for most of us, I think, is anathema. It's just
Well,
not
they
the
can
way
be
we're.
melodies that aren't melodies in a sense that aren't tonal, right? Maybe you think of some, I don't know, music from other cultures.
Oh yeah, well,
There
there's
might be
that too.
something catchy, but it's not exactly tonal in our sense. Just
No,
might,
but I think our perception of harmony is, to a certain extent, universal. Obviously, there are different tuning systems in different cultures. Certainly, we
yeah,
can't compare, the classical Greek modes, which were
yeah,
adopted by, Western music in the Baroque era and before, with the ragas of Hindu music.
yeah,
But there are similar types of things. I mean, the overtone scale exists whether you employ its symmetries or not. It is part of the natural order of things.
yes, yes,
And so I think all people experience it to some degree or another. Obviously, we're talking pentatonic scales, such as we have with China and Japan. Well, that's a little different,
yeah.
and I wouldn't feel qualified at all to talk about Hindu music, or
Yeah. Well, I know
any
here in
of the.
Japan, well, in America, you go in the supermarket and you hear tonal music,
Yeah,
music, right?
yeah,
Cheap stuff normally, but nonetheless. But here you hear,
yeah.
there's one place I go, and I like to go to the place. They have good prices. On the other hand, they they make it a habit to play 1950s American rock music. I'm thinking,
Oh,
I'm in Japan, but at all places here, you never hear traditional Japanese music coming through the music system.
no, surely they're playing Christmas carols this time of the year, right?
Unfortunately, but not "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," but like Frosty the Snowman, that just
Oh yeah, I know
drives
the
me up the
the commercial
wall.
stuff. Yeah, yeah,
I mean, for me, there could be two Christmas songs:
yeah,
"Adeste Fidelis," "O Come All Ye Faithful,"
yeah.
and "Okay, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen" is good too. But then "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." It's not if it wouldn't there wouldn't be Christmas if that song didn't exist for me personally. That's only
Okay.
subjective, people. But when I hear Frosty and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, oh my God. These things written in the 1950s and for commercial purposes more than anything else, they just disgust me. But once again, that's my own subjective opinion. Nothing against Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I'm sure it's a
No.
fine reindeer.
Yeah.
I don't want to badmouth him. I just don't like that song.
Yeah.
And
That's
Frosty
okay.
the
We'll
Snowman.
we'll we'll let it slide this
Yeah.
once.
Anyway, yeah. Now Saturn Neptune
Yeah.
is an aspect of poverty often. Now this isn't a very close one.
Yeah.
Either poverty or a sense of lack. I'll put it that way, because a lot of people in poverty stricken, of course, have a sense of lack, but you don't have to be poverty stricken to have Saturn Neptune in a strong aspect conjunction. Abraham Lincoln had Saturn
Yeah.
Neptune in conjunction.
That's interesting.
And he was born into great poverty, of course.
Oh,
That wasn't the
just
case with Mozart,
legendary,
but
legendary poverty,
yeah,
if we can
log
use
cabin,
that
dirt
term.
floor, that sort of
Yeah,
thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And no welfare check at the beginning of the month,
No,
right?
no,
So
no, no.
imagine. And then when you look at how he suffered because of the Civil War,
Yeah,
that he actually started, but nonetheless, he still calls it great
yeah,
suffering, right?
yeah, yeah,
He
yeah.
was the one that really started it. If you examine it with an open mind. I am a Lincoln fan, but facts are facts. But this
Yeah.
Saturn Neptune idea of a feeling of lacking, a sense of the mystical these people have, because Saturn is the concrete world, and like you said before, Neptune is the mystical, the spiritual world, and there's a conflict there.
Yeah.
Interesting that communism has as its signature astrologically Saturn Neptune as well. But of course,
Yeah.
there's no spirituality. Of course, they don't believe in that. It's only about the material and the economics. But what happens there? Well, they use Neptune in another sense, the great lies that are told, basically. Sure. So Neptune is getting its due, but in another sense. And
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
with Mozart now, he has this Saturn Neptune.
Yeah.
I can only sense that he must have felt a great sense of lack. First of all, because the overpowering father, who was also a composer, of course, Leopold Mozart,
Yes, I know. Yeah.
violin school, and of course he wasn't as great as his son, not nearly. But he always had to live up to the father. Hey, the stone guest, right? In Don Giovanni.
Yep. All right.
Psychologists say that's well, you explain that connection there to
Can you
the
explain
father.
that?
You go.
Well, I mean, I
yeah.
think that again, I did actually write a long essay on Mozart for my fourth book,
Yeah.
but I didn't get too much into the relationship with the father. But
Oh, because some say this theory, I don't know who came up with it, but
Yeah.
that the stone guest in Don Giovanni that Don Giovanni is so terrified of, that was to Mozart his father, the father figure.
Yeah, no, I would
Because
concur with that. I think
well,
it had to
it
have
might
been.
be, it might not be. I don't know, but it is interesting. And with the Sun Saturn, I'll get personal here. I also have Sun Saturn in conjunction, and of course, I had basically a good relationship with my father, but I always felt like I had to live up to his expectations
Yeah,
because he knew that, well, because of my intelligence and everything, he always expected from me I had to get better marks than my sister.
yeah,
Right, because things were expected. At first, I was the first child, and first children always have that disadvantage somehow. Of course, in Mozart's case, he had an older sister, but anyway,
yeah,
often it's the case with the first child, or if the child's somehow special, you expect more from the child. But there's a
yeah.
situation where, the father figure is there, a strong father figure, and he expects something from you. And I felt that pressure, I have to say.
Yeah.
Not that he got mad if I got a B instead of an A. I don't mean like that. But when I got a D in chemistry in high school, he was mad
Yeah.
because he was a straight A student and he was especially good in things like chemistry. So here with Mozart, I would think too, living up to the father's expectations. The father knew he was a genius when he was a little kid, but now he had to make something of that genius.
Right. Sure. Of course.
In the concrete world, he had to get a job. He had to work for dukes or princes, which really didn't want to do, but
Yeah.
to work his way up in the world. And Mozart had his problems with that.
Well, it was. I mean, the simple truth was that back then, patronage was really the only way that a musician could make a living, unless they, like Bach, they had a church gig. I mean, it just wasn't there wasn't anything like the type of system, which admittedly has its flaws, that we've had for about the last century. There's something to be said about patronage, in that it does allow certain things to flourish, but by the same token, if you're constantly having to satisfy the expectations of wealthy people who probably are largely ignorant, it could also be extremely frustrating, I think.
Yes, indeed.
And
but then with that Neptune there, a Neptunian person, they want to get lost. That's one way of saying it. Neptune opposition Sun. It could be a mental illness. It could be they just want to get away from it all, go someplace. We musicians are escapists anyway. Let's face it.
Yeah, sure.
Part of the reason why we like music, we want to escape the hard world and obligations and all this. We just want to lose ourselves in the world of beauty.
Yep.
And even the drug addict, that seems low and sleazy, but they feel beauty when, I imagine, I'm not a drug addict, I don't never take these illegal drugs, but they feel really great. They're feeling something special, which for them is beautiful as long as it lasts, and then they feel, of course, miserable. But nonetheless, the love of music is a kind of escape, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's an inkling of what's beyond this world.
Yeah.
But then when you're forced into a certain scheme, you have to get a job and work for a prince, and you just want to be free, especially being an Aquarius. You just want to be free of all that. And then I'm seeing his Uranus exactly on the cusp of the descendant. Right. So in his relations, he was very Uranian, and that in Pisces. Yeah. What's your take on that one?
Well, again, a desire for independence. He would probably not want to be tied down in any way, shape, or form, and it must have been challenging, because seventh house, of course, isn't just marriage, but it's also business contracts and business relationships, and also to a certain extent, our perception by others, so it suggests that people may have thought that he was a bit problematic. And certainly there are aspects of his personal history that would suggest that he ran afoul of the authorities in Vienna. Vienna, was it Vienna? Yeah, I think it was Vienna. Later in life. Of course, he was a Freemason. That's the other thing that
yes, of course,
might have made him a little suspect in people's minds. Even though Freemasonry, obviously, many powerful people belonged to the Masons.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly the same as it is now.
No.
And even now, there's so many variants of it.
Yeah. The thing that strikes me, too, as I look at the map, is that the Mercury in Aquarius has dominion over both ascendant and midheaven, at least in this map. I think that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
can you go into that a bit?
Well, we've got Virgo rising, right? So, I mean, Virgo is a vehicle for a professional musician. I mean, again, that harkens to me of the kind of Apollonian perfection of his music. You know, that the details are so beautifully worked out, and again, not without inspiration, obviously, but as the vehicle for his. And it may have also suggests, that he would have the misfortune, to run afoul of authorities, because he, even within the narrow constraints in which he was forced to abide, he flouted them as much as he could. He essentially stayed true to his own personal muse, his own inspiration. But that must have been a delicate balancing act at times. And of course, then Gemini on the midheaven, this tells us that this is someone who came in to really communicate in a very significant way. And then we have.
Oh wait, just
Mars.
Gemini in the midheaven? That'd be one person in 12 that came in the world to communicate in a significant way. That can't be.
No, he can't be right.
Just because of Gemini in the midheaven?
Well, Gemini, if we look at it through the standpoint of the traditional house rulerships, it has to do with the third house, which I consider one of the two throat chakra houses. So, I mean, that very much is.
But I mean, Gemini midheaven, one person in 12 has that.
Oh, I know.
So if you say one person 12 comes in the world to do something a significant way, well, we all do in a sense, or.
Well, but not to the degree that he did. And
well, yeah, but that's just because we know there was Mozart, but a lot of people have Gemini in the midheaven.
So what would you say about Gemini in the midheaven then?
Gee, I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, well, the fact that
all right, Mr. Gadfly.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I'm being honest here. I don't know. I mean, one could say that it's sextile his Neptune, but then a lot of people would have that too. It's square his Uranus. Well, now it gets interesting, because now we have Uranus and Neptune.
Yeah.
In an aspect to that.
Oh yeah, you're looking at the equal houses. Yeah. Yeah, I've got
no. I'm looking at the midheaven. I'm looking.
Yeah, no. But with midheaven, it's 12 degrees Gemini. I've got 8. So in the Placidus, Mercury trines the midheaven. So there's a sort of a double Mercurian signature.
Yes, that's a good point. Well, the Sun and Mercury trine the midheaven. Now that's something. Not 1 in 12 people don't have that. So I think in the end, you're right. I just want you to specify more, because then also we have the Neptune sextile. So we have the Sun, Mercury, and Neptune. All then an aspect of the midheaven. Yeah, that does give it more significance than the one person in 12. Yeah. So I will stand corrected there in this chart of.
Yeah. But I mean, it would work obviously with the equal houses as well. So.
Yes, indeed. In that case, you would have Uranus square the midheaven, which of course would also fit.
Yes. So that's a very powerful linkage between the 5th house of creativity and the 10th of vocation, and that certainly suggests to us that this would be someone that would come in who would have a great deal to say creatively that would be communicated readily to the wider world. I also want to point out that the 0 degrees Cancer Mars is in the 10th.
Now, yes.
Now that's at the Aries point. I don't know if we necessarily want to get into that, but but that is often an indication that the endeavors of such individuals will reach a wide audience, and also the Mars is out of bounds. Now I know how you feel about out of bounds planets.
Hey, show me enough examples where it works, and I'll be a convert.
Yeah. Well, what do you think if we were talking about what would Mars in Cancer to you have to say about Mozart? What does that say?
Well, okay. Mars is, of course, your activity. It's basically the centrifugal force, the movement outwards in a certain direction.
Right.
And so it's how we project ourselves, the activities we do, how we react in that sense. Well, it's more active than reactive, actually. In Cancer, that's a sign, of course, of feeling, of great feeling. So here he's acting somehow in an emotional realm. Now, you can't tell just from that it's music, although then we have a trine relatively close to Venus, so then the artistic comes into it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
As well. And then it's in the 10th house, so it could have to do with his profession. So we could say, well, here's a person who acts very emotionally in part, and maybe also aesthetically with the trine Venus, and that's part of his profession. And now we're inching our way closer and closer to music.
Yeah.
through that.
Yeah.
How would you
Yeah.
see it?
Yeah. Well, definitely. Absolutely. What else can I say about this guy?
What about Jupiter in the second house? Because some would say in tradition, oh, he must have been really wealthy. But of course, you can read, oh, yes, he never had much money, etc., etc. How does that then jive?
Well, I mean, Jupiter, the second house doesn't just have to do with money, as I know you know, but it has to do with one's sense of security.
Yeah.
And it suggests that perhaps despite, somewhat straitened circumstances at time, that he had a remarkable degree of self-possession and self-confidence.
That's pretty certain. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that
If
Jupiter.
not to say arrogance.
Oh, well, I mean, maybe a little bit.
Yeah,
I
if
mean,
you
he
think of the
certainly
way he treated, the way he talked about other musicians, this guy had a very petty side to him as
a
well.
very what was the word? Sorry, a
Petty.
very what? Edgy?
Petty,
Oh, petty.
P-E-T-T,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
He could be
Yeah.
very petty, as a matter of fact. For example, with Muzio Clementi. Muzio Clementi was also a great composer. Not as great as Mozart, but was a great composer. He was actually a better pianist than Mozart was.
Ah.
He was a great virtuoso. But what did Mozart say? One time, for example, they had a piano duel for
Yeah.
some prince or whatever. They used to do that,
interesting.
And they're both praised.
Yeah.
No winner was really decided in that sense. But technically, Clementi was like the Horowitz of his time, if you want to put it like
Right.
that. He could, double passages of double thirds, fast octaves, you name it. He was great. But Mozart wrote about that. He's just a technician. He plays all things really fast, but he has no real soul. It's no real soul in what he's playing. Well, I don't believe that because Clementi was a great musician, but that often shone through with Mozart. Interesting there too. Talking about piano duels, there was another one he had with a guy. I forget his name though. I recorded some of his music a few years ago. He had been a captain in the 7 Years' War.
Yeah.
And he was a pianist also. And some other composer musician heard them in his piano duel and said that actually Mozart could sight read anything. It was totally amazing. But as far as expression was concerned, the other guy was better than Mozart. I thought that was interesting. There are no recorded comments of what Mozart said about that, but Mozart could be very petty and be very biting. The Virgo ascendant.
Yeah, that's another way we could interpret it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, he was a genius. On the other hand, he could be very generous. He just adored Haydn and his music. He was like a second father figure to him. And C.P.E. Bach, he famously said when the news of Bach died in 1788, and Mozart said he was the father and we were the children. So he could be very generous in what he said, about really great musicians. But other times when there was competition direct, then he could be very petty.
So there's that out of bounds Mars talking then, right? Very.
Oh yes, okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And admittedly, that kind of virtuoso display really is an athletic endeavor, in certain respects, absolutely, I think.
Yes,
so
but on the other hand, if you think of Horowitz or Liszt, or pianists like that also that grips you.
Oh yeah, no question.
See, this is one reason why I didn't like the film Amadeus. I mean, it was lavish and beautiful and all that. But first of all, the actor that played, I forget the guy's name. What's his name that played Mozart?
Tom Hulse.
Oh yeah, he looked like an American college student.
Yeah,
and believe me, Mozart was not like this. Anybody with interested should look up the Mozart series from the 1980s. It was a TV series in Europe. I can't find it in English. I only find it in Italian and Spanish. I'm going to watch it with my wife in Spanish. And an actor named Christian Banzer played Mozart. He did such a good job because Mozart could be very superficial and silly. I mean, really silly. Yeah. Really superficial, really vulgar, but he had a very deep and sad side to him as well. And that actor brought that out. The guy in Amadeus didn't bring that out whatsoever. And when they showed him playing the piano with him, throwing his hands really high, Mozart didn't play the piano like that.
Yeah.
All contemporaries say he played with very little finger movement because he had first learned on the harpsichord. And it was none of these exaggerated it was very controlled and very minimalistic, almost Bach-like in the movements. Yeah, and I don't like movies that take the historical reality and just totally turn it around. I just don't enjoy movies like that. I want to see Mozart as he was, and he was really a very deep person. Extremely sensitive, we see with the Neptune here. We'll get into something else about those feelings. Extremely sensitive, extremely deep, with his inner conflicts. a very sad side to him, no doubt also a depressed side to him, very nervous person as well. If you've looked at his handwriting, he had a typical, very nervous kind of handwriting. He was a person who was filled with ideas, probably of all sorts, not just musical, always going through his mind. You can tell in his handwriting, just totally nervous on the one hand. No doubt he had some complexes, but then he had arrogance at the same time. And a very interesting, deep, in part troubled personality. And in Amadeus, that was not brought out whatsoever. And that's why it disgusted me. But to get to the feelings now, and you haven't mentioned it yet, an almost exact conjunction between Moon and Pluto and Sagittarius in the fourth house.
Yeah, no, I was just looking at it. Yeah,
I knew you'd get around to it.
yeah, that would certainly relate to intense feeling, I would think, for sure.
Wow. Wouldn't it though? But here we have it in Sagittarius. So this Moon, these feelings that are kind of, exuberant and manic.
Yeah.
That has something of the manic in it, of the manic depressive. Oh, now it's bipolar, but we don't say manic depressive anymore. It's not politically correct. Now we have to say bipolar, and in 10 years it'll be something else. Because, but I just call it what it is, manic depressive. He had something manic depressive about him, almost certainly, this person. Not that he was, clinically bipolar and half crazy. I don't mean that. But also with the Sagittarius Moon, and then with the intensity of Pluto.
Yeah.
Deep, the lowest part of the chart.
They square Uranus, of course.
That too. The Moon Uranus. That's interesting. With parental figures and with the home in general. As a little kid, he was constantly traveling to these other countries, to Italy and to England and to France. So he couldn't really settle down.
Yeah. Makes me wonder about the relationship with the mother, about whom we know nothing. But that's
very little. Apparently, he got along well with her. But then, of course, she died when he was in Paris, right? As I recall.
Oh yeah.
Was in 1778, I think. I should have read his biography again. I haven't read one in years. But he was in Paris then, and he got a letter from his father that the mother had died, and that really. I don't want to believe. Well, people died younger back in those days anyway. In general.
They did. And, but also, I mean, you mentioned the exuberance, but Sagittarius is also, of course, the sign of the natural philosopher. So there's also, I think, the deep, the capacity, to be.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring out. First of all, I think I'd mentioned to you in a private conversation, the prevalence of Moon and Sagittarius among composers of that time. Haydn, born in 1732, if I recall correctly, he had the Moon in Sagittarius. He was the inspiration and like a second father figure for Mozart with Moon in Sagittarius. C.P.E. Bach, that inspired all of them, had the Moon in Sagittarius. Beethoven then had the Moon in Sagittarius. Clementi did not, but I looked at his chart before we started talking today, and he had 3 planets in Sagittarius. And he had the Moon in Aries, but then he had Venus between Saturn and Pluto in Sagittarius, and then with the Moon conjunction Mars in Aries. It's interesting, this Sagittarius aspect, the freedom that Sagittarius represents and the exuberance, because in what we call now the classical period, I don't really like that term for that, because you say classical music, but then within that there's a classical period, and let me tell you, if we could go back in time and talk to a Mozart or a Clementi or a Haydn or a young Beethoven or a C.P. Bach, and if we could say to them, well, you're going to be considered classical composers, comparing the Greek architecture, the classical form, they'd say, what? But we're romantics. They would all say they're romantics. If you look at C.P.E. Bach, he was writing romantic music 70 years before there was such a thing. Well, just about 50, 60 years, to be more exact, maybe. And so we think classic because of the beauty of the forms, especially in Mozart, the form, the harmony in the form. And so we think classical, but he would have said, hey, I'm expressing true feeling.
Yeah.
Right. These people were influenced by Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, what the sufferings of young Werther, that Goethe novel about some young fool, I say in my older age, who falls in love, and his beloved is married or something, so he ends up committing suicide. And that was an interesting case, because there were hundreds of suicides throughout Europe, people who read that book. Young people that also had unrequited love, or just love that couldn't be realized. And so they thought, I'm going to follow Werther's example and kill myself. I think Goethe felt bad about that later. But
the
this was
tragic.
highly romantic. There's nothing classical about this. This is because Goethe really was a classicist, had something of a romanticist, but he was really the Virgo classicist. And yes, he was still romantic even his old age, just like the mixture. But these composers were their idiom was very personal way and very, I don't see it as classical, but we're stuck within the confines of these names that we give to certain periods. But here we have a man who certainly had feelings like you wouldn't believe, and very intense feelings as well. Probably intense loves, intense hatreds, intense exuberance, and just that Moon, Pluto, and Sagittarius is, if that were a normal, say, astrology client, what would you say? If this were just a normal person that says, oh, here's my chart, can you tell me something of you wouldn't say you're a great musician. I don't think so. If you didn't know Mozart,
I mean, there is that, isn't it? I mean, there is a modicum of planets in water. You have Mars and Uranus, both in water, and but all of that air. Yeah, I mean, it's like, wow, that's.
He could be a string player, and he also played the violin, because string players, there tend to be more of air signs, I've noticed.
Ah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and maybe because of the ethereal nature of the sound of violin or whatever. And of course, he loved stringed instruments. I think he played all of them, didn't he? I think in a quartet he played the viola part because he wanted to be like within the work.
Right.
In the middle voice there, because somehow I remember reading that. I know I probably was 18 or something. Hope I'm not getting it wrong. But this air connection with Aquarius, a lot of violinists there, though of course he was mainly a pianist. The Jupiter in the second house, it's interesting because he wasn't born in a rich family, whatever, and sometimes in mythology, so to speak, the Mozart mythology, oh yes, he didn't have enough money. But from what I've read by serious historians, he made more than enough money, but he was a spendthrift.
Yeah.
And if you figure, if we want to get into rulerships, well, okay, the second house ruled by Libra, which would be Venus, and they're in Aquarius and trine Mars. So easy come, easy go. I think that was more or less his motto. That's why he had some financial difficulties, because he couldn't hold on to money.
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily exclude the Moon Jupiter from those considerations either. Sagittarius,
right. Yes,
I'm sorry, Moon Pluto, because Sagittarius likes to party.
Right, yeah, and so, we want to buy this. Oh, let's go buy it. Let's do this and let's do that. Let's just have fun, right? Now, how do you see his extramarital affairs? I think he had a number of.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know that much about them, but Venus in Aquarius, is certainly, I would say probably would translate into being fairly fickle, very sociable. So within the, the context of normal, a polite societal, whatever we want to call it, intercourse, for want of a better term. I think it would be easy enough to, for him to not necessarily succumb, or perhaps seduce other women very easily. It's interesting because he's got Capricorn on the fifth house, which is the house of love affairs, but then he's got 3 planets in it. So that also suggests, the likelihood that there could be extramarital dalliances.
The Virgo ascendant is more adapted in that sense, but then remember, he has that opposition Uranus to the degree. Yeah. And so it was just, let's burst out of this and do this or that. His marriage, I think, was fairly good despite that. Yeah. And, maybe we shouldn't talk about his personal love life, but what the hell?
I mean, that's what sells books,
part of his chart. He wouldn't care. I think it's more or less a free spirit there. And he met so many people and beautiful singers and things like, the temptation was so close.
Yeah. Well, you have to have your muse, right? I mean, that's just that's the rules,
Well, now when we get to the sad part, when he got his illness, I think they still don't know what that was exactly. I've read like kidney problems or some kind of a poisoning. No, Salieri did not poison him. That's historically kind of ridiculous.
They called it miliary fever, which is sometimes tuberculosis, I think.
But I don't know if yeah, I don't know if there's anything to support that with, spitting up blood and such things. I don't know any stories of that I can recall now.
No, I mean, I don't know if you read that essay that I sent you from
Yes, I did.
our mutual colleague,
Yes, yeah.
but he makes some interesting points about the very peculiar nature of the disease, which seemed to vary from reporter to reporter. Nobody was really sure what it was.
Yeah, but that could just be speculation on their part, and doesn't have to be anything.
Of course.
And I don't think that he faked his own death. So,
Yeah.
I don't think there's really, that's kind of ridiculous, if only because we'd have to assume that nobody that knew Mozart, and he knew a lot of people, nobody happened to notice that he was then still around, and he severed all ties to all musicians. And really, I mean, that's just, for that reason alone, I think it's ridiculous. But if we get to his death, and I have nothing against reading such articles, because maybe you can find something, but I think that's a baseless conspiracy theory. Nothing against conspiracy theories.
Oh, we love
because as we know, we love it because a lot of them really are true because conspiracies happen. But this is really a conspiracy theory with not a sound basis whatsoever. And so I reject it on those grounds. But if you think of his death, whatever it was, here we have Aries in the cusp of the 8th house. That could suggest a quick death, but he was wasting away, not necessarily in the sense of consumption, but he was sick for a while. So it's not their Arian, right? How do you see his young death, for example? Because the guy was like a month before his 36th birthday.
Yeah, well, when I wrote my own essay, I did look at the high leg and see if it
Could you define that term for the audience here?
Okay, for those of you that don't know, in traditional astrology, there's believed to be one planet is defined as what they refer to as the Apheta, or the life giver of the chart. So it's also sometimes referred to as the high leg, and it's sort of the
spelled Hyleg.
Leg, yeah. And the problem, of course, is, as I know David knows, is that there's so many different ways to address these types of things. Every ancient commentator on these types of things has a different way of calculating the high leg and how to deal with it. But basically, you have this is the life giver. So if at some crucial juncture, at some year, it's impacted by a malefic, obviously Mars or Saturn in traditional astrology, it's a sign that the person could be in grave danger. And the high leg is also, depending on where it is and what planet it is, it's also supposed to promise a certain number of years. And
so what's the high leg in his chart?
Well, I'm trying to remember what I determined what it was. Give me a second here. But I did come to the conclusion that it's possible that he might have lived longer.
If it were modern times, if had modern medicine, almost certainly they could have prolonged his life one way or the other, right? If it was like a kidney problem, they could have given a new kidney, or right, even if it was kidney problems that he died of.
Yeah, what did I? Yeah, I think I had to finally settle on the moon, and the other thing about the high leg is that it promises certain years depending on its disposition. So the middle number.
Well, how do you go about determining this high leg? I read about this at the beginning of astrology, but I rejected the whole theory.
Yeah,
of it,
well, you have to.
But maybe I was wrong. How do you determine what the high leg is?
Well, it has to occupy one of the aphetic places, which
define that.
Okay, according to Ptolemy, now we're going back now to 1st century AD, in his book Tetrabiblos, the aphetic places were from the 25th degree of the 8th house to the 25th degree of the 11th house. So that's basically mostly 9, 10, and 11. From the 25th degree of the 12th house to the 25th degree of the 1st, and from the 25th degree of the 6th to the 25th degree of the 7th. Yeah. So if the sun is in any of those places, it becomes the high leg. If not, then the moon is the next choice. If neither planet seems to be disposed to serve in this function, then you can go to the planet that had the most essential dignity at the moment of the lunation prior to birth. Or otherwise in a day.
In other words, it's extremely complex before you can ever determine what a high leg is.
No question about it. I've only played around with it a few times. But as I said, I think I finally settled on the moon. And in its middle number of years, which again has to do with its cosmic state, it promised 66.5 years. And plus, again, it's fairly complicated, but it did suggest that he might have lived longer. A progression of the high leg to a killing planet, that's the other part of the equation, is you have what's known as the Theta, which is the high leg, but then you have the Anereta, which is the killing planet, which in this case would be Mars. That didn't actually happen until age 68. So I thought, well, it's a possibility, that maybe he might have lived longer if.
Well, yeah, but you could always say that. I don't know. I would see more just his sun, the vital energy. Well, it has Saturn and Neptune. Well, that's kind of not a good sign for the vital energy.
Two malefics for sure.
He was relatively small. He wasn't a really big, strong guy. He was relatively small. So he didn't have a whole lot of vital energy in that sense. He was living largely maybe on nervous energy. But then the moon, exactly conjunct Pluto, there we have a somewhat dangerous planet conjunct his moon almost exactly. And then his ascendant was opposition Uranus, so there we have that as well. When you look at all that together, and then you consider 18th century modern medicine wasn't so developed, you could think, well, this person probably won't live all that long. I would have said back then. Now, I wouldn't have said he would die at 35. I wouldn't have said that. He could have been dying at birth, for that matter. You don't know that. Yeah. But it doesn't look like a chart of somebody who's going to live to be 80 years old back in the 18th century.
Yeah, no, the sun isn't in great cosmic state, as you pointed out. I mean, it's in its detriment, and the moon is peregrine, as you pointed out, with Pluto, and certainly Uranus with the ascendant is probably not a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I guess we've more or less done a skimming over of his chart and brought out some interesting points. I'd like to encourage other people to go to astro.com. I'm going to put the link to this chart that we're looking at there, so you can go and find out other things for yourself. Hey, look at his directions and progressions. It'd be interesting to do for the time of his death and such things, right, for the date of his death. And you can never get to the roots of a person through studying their chart, no matter how much you do it, but especially not in 1 hour as we did. This is just having fun with a natal chart and going and seeing how much we can see the personality of Mozart. Finally, I'd like to ask you, is this a person that could have been a friend of yours on a personal level?
A friend of mine?
Yeah. Would you have gotten along with this person?
Well, I've certainly had friends that were Aquarians in the past. I've got Aquarius rising, so I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. It looks like he could have been a laugh at times, a good time, go out.
I was thinking that too. I think I could joke around with him a whole lot, but I think sooner or later there'd come some kind of a break. What I'd say. But I'd just be fed up with him. Because he's the kind of person you get fed up with, I think, pretty easily in some regards. But it depends. But
he certainly seemed to have little tolerance for people that he deemed not to be particularly talented.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm a musician and proud of what I can do. But compared to Mozart, I'm a nobody. And I think, frankly, any musician you can say, compared to Mozart, But then I'd have an advantage over you, Michelangelo, in that sense, because I don't even try to compose.
Yeah.
If I tried to compose, then imagine the things he might say. Right?
Oh yeah. Well, and I'm decidedly a minor composer in that I've only ever composed art songs, and that just really,
Yeah, but who'd like to be compared to Mozart in writing songs? I don't think many of us would.
No.
Except maybe Paul McCartney, because he could always say, "Hey, look, pal, I'm more popular than you are, and I've made millions and millions more than you could ever even imagine." So there.
Yeah.
You're not Paul McCartney, then forget
there
it.
There is that for sure. I think we could hang out for a while. Sure.
Yeah, he'd probably be fun to do, especially with if alcohol is involved. You loosen up a little and just start making, talking about women or something like that. I think he could be great fun in the conversation, but probably not very politically correct.
No. Well, I mean,
which would be fine with me. So we get along fabulously.
Yeah, well, you're not particularly politically correct, so I mean that's
No political correctness.
and neither
I'll never
am
forget the
I.
first
So,
time I heard that term. I was taking a trip back to America because I lived, as you know, in Europe since the
yeah,
70s. And one year I went back and people were talking about politically correct. Oh, that sounds like Stalinism, which of course it is.
yeah,
Which of
yeah,
course it is. The idea you shouldn't talk
yeah,
about things because politically it's not correct is
yeah.
so communist fascist. And yet people accept it and they wear that
Oh yeah,
badge
no, it's.
proudly. I
I
am
mean,
politically
even
correct.
before wokeism, PC was ruining so many things.
No, but
You
that's
know,
not from me. I'm sure Mozart was not politically correct.
no,
He
he ran
really,
afoul of the authorities. I
yes,
think
indeed,
that's
yes.
fairly well
Good for you,
established.
Mozart.
Yeah,
And what if he was listening to our interpretation of him up from the
I don't know.
astral world or wherever he
Maybe he
may be
was. Yeah,
residing right
yeah,
now, or from down there? You never
yeah.
know if there is a
Yep.
down there. Okay,
Yeah,
well, we're
most
going to end this now because otherwise we'll just go on. We could go on for
sure.
hours in this vein. Thank you, Michelangelo, for this talk today and for your wisdom and knowledge about
Absolutely,
astrology.
David. It's always very stimulating to chat with you about these things, and
Oh, I enjoy it so greatly to talk to
yeah,
you.
neither one of us is dogmatic, so we can roll with the punches and go
And
with the
we play
flow.
with
So it's
ideas,
yeah, absolutely.
and we'll continue to do so. Thanks for listening, people. And
Yep,
till the next chapter, whoever that may be,
that's
stay
right.
tuned.
We're just two guys talking about charts.
That's it. So bye for
Ciao
now.
for now. Yeah, ciao.